On August 6, 1945, the sky over Japan tore open. In mere seconds, a single blast wiped out entire cities, vaporizing thousands and introducing the permanent threat of nuclear annihilation. To understand how humanity reached this extreme, we have to rewind 26 years. In 1919, the ashes of the First World War were still settling. Surviving nations were desperate to ensure this would never happen again. Their solution was the Treaty of Versailles. The victorious powers forced Germany to sign a war guilt clause, assigning total blame for the previous conflict. Along with the blame came a crippling penalty, $33 billion in reparations. The nations that signed this treaty believed they were securing a permanent peace, but by stripping a major power of its wealth and its military status, they left behind a massive economic instability that the existing global order was unprepared to handle. This chart shows the extreme devaluation of the German mark in the 1920s. To pay reparations, the government printed money. Within a year, the cost of a bread packet spiked from 160 to 200 billion marks. The nation's economy collapsed entirely. 6 million people lost their jobs, wiping out savings overnight. Ordinary citizens were reduced to waiting in massive queues just to secure basic food rations to keep their families alive. A young political outsider named Adolf Hitler capitalized on this crushing despair. He held rallies pointing a finger at internal scapegoats and promised the freezing, starving public that he would tear up the Treaty of Versailles, seek ultimate revenge, and restore the empire's glory. By 1933, the population was desperate enough to give him total control. Severe poverty and international humiliation had provided the exact conditions needed for fascism to take root. Once in power, Hitler immediately broke the rules of the treaty. He rebuilt the German military, expanded the air force, and marched troops into neighboring regions like Austria and Czechoslovakia to absorb their land and resources. The major European powers watched this happen. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and other leaders practiced appeasement, giving in to these territorial demands in exchange for promises of peace. But the concessions only encouraged further expansion. The breaking point arrived on September 1, 1939. Nearly 1 million German troops crossed the border into Poland. Realizing diplomacy had failed, Britain and France officially declared war. Germany deployed a combat doctrine known as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The strategy relied on the simultaneous, high-speed assault of bomber planes and armor. To maintain this relentless pace day and night, the infantry was heavily supplied with a drug called paved, a form of crystal meth. Traditional militaries were unprepared for this speed. France had spent years building the Maginot Line, a massive, static wall of concrete bunkers. The German army simply drove their mechanized units right around it, through a dense forest, collapsing the French defense in weeks. The combination of initial passive diplomacy from the Allies and a hyper-aggressive mechanized combat strategy allowed the fascist forces to sweep across Western Europe with very little resistance. By mid-1940, the map of Europe had been redrawn. With France surrendered, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his besieged island nation stood as the sole remaining opposition to the Nazi regime in the West. Hitler's critical tactical error was Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion into the Soviet Union, betraying a peace pact with Joseph Stalin. But pushing into the vast Russian landmass fractured their strategy. Supply lines stretched incredibly thin, and food and fuel struggled to reach the front. Then the brutal Russian winter hit. Temperatures plummeted. German vehicles froze, and soldiers lacked winter gear. Adapted to the extreme cold, the Soviet army seized the advantage, surrounding and systematically dismantling the exhausted invading force. The German leadership believed their own propaganda of invincibility. By ignoring the environmental realities of a two-front war across thousands of miles, they sealed their own defeat. While Europe burned, the conflict jumped across the globe. Seeking total control of the Pacific Ocean, Japan launched a surprise military strike against the American naval fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. Up to this point, the United States had refused to enter the fighting. The sudden loss of thousands of American lives instantly erased that isolationism. The U.S. declared war, formally linking Britain, the Soviet Union, and America into a unified Allied force. This newly formed alliance launched an industrial-scale counteroffensive. On June 6, 1944, over 150,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, successfully opening a massive Western front to liberate France. The Nazi forces were now caught in a vice. The Soviet army steadily pushed in from the east, while the American and British forces advanced from the west. As the Allies finally surrounded Berlin in the spring of 1945, Hitler took his own life in a bunker. It required the combined industrial, military, and human resources of the world's remaining powers to finally crush the Axis advance. This bar chart compares the casualties of the two world wars. While the First World War primarily killed soldiers, the Second World War was drastically different. Of the estimated 60 to 80 million people who died, the vast majority were innocent civilians. The destruction extended far past the battlefields. To feed the Allied armies, the British Empire heavily redirected grain and resources out of its colonies. In India, this extraction triggered the man-made Bengal famine of 1943, starving an estimated 3 million people to death. This was the reality of total war. Beyond targeting soldiers on the front line, nations systematically consumed the agricultural and economic lifeblood of entire continents. The fighting finally stopped in September 1945, but only after the United States dropped 2 atomic weapons on Japan. Humanity had achieved peace, but it now possessed the technology to completely annihilate itself. The global hierarchy was fractured. The European empires were bankrupt, accelerating the push for independence across Asian and African colonies. Germany, the aggressor of the conflict, was physically carved in half by the victorious Allied and Soviet forces. Realizing how close they came to total ruin, the surviving nations attempted to build stronger international safety nets. They replaced the failed League of Nations with the United Nations and began integrating European coal and steel markets to make future wars economically impossible. This conflict acted as a violent reset for global civilization. The borders on our maps, the international institutions created to prevent war, and the balance of nuclear power we live with today were all constructed as direct responses to the trauma of these 6 years.